Hello, welcome to another Abley Fireside. I'm Chris, this is Todd, this is Hamish, and today we're talking about non-data processing uses of FME.
So typically a lot of our us and our wider audience, our introduction to FME is through the spatial sciences and through spatial data and spatial manipulation, often coming from the Esri platform. And then I've noticed that people tend to expand out and realise that spatial data is really just a form of data with a location, whether that's an X, Y or a lat and long. But what we've also found is that FME can go wider than just data that you typically store within a table or an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV. And ultimately, each feature that passes through is just a snippet of data, and that data could be anything. It could be a file path, it could be a borehole, it could be a road, but it can also be things like scripts and lines and scripts that you can build to then input into other systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't know how you feed a road into FME, but that's kind of cool. But what we're kind of talking about is all the things that support data. So whether that be running a process to make sure that data's clean, or building the process that runs to make sure data's clean, or whether that means creating the schema that your data is going to go into. FME can do those things. I suppose one of the good examples I can think of straight off the bat is we used to run an organisation that had 17 different configurations on how people viewed a GIS web map program and what they saw. And actually we used to use FME to build that configuration. So, if you were adding something to 12 of the 17 different roles, instead of having to go through and manually add all this long list of configuration bits and pieces, you could actually just type into one file saying we're releasing this bit into this configuration, and then have FME run through all of those things and create all the configuration details utilising other inputs that actually define what those configurations were.
I've actually done something really similar with, some of you probably recognise a tool called Web Builder. Was building custom configurations so that different regions of a wider metropolitan area would click on their specific sort of suburb or sub-region, and it would zoom straight to there and would only display data that is actually relevant, that falls within their area. And it was still just one core web map, but it had dozens of different configuration files that when the data sets changed or updated, just ran an FME process and it would recalculate the spatial extents, figure out any where clauses or definition queries to put on that data, and then you just then copy and paste dozens of JSON files into a repository, and it would just feed into that viewer.
And to actually just building those files, it's basically just like attribute creators. Maybe you have some conditional statements, maybe you have some lists and candidates to kind of bring it all together, but it's all just simple manipulation really, isn't it?
Definitely, and it can even be, I think in this case it was data driven because it was driven from the spatial extent of each region, and it would find the layers that intersected and set the appropriate bounds. And this was a few years ago, so I can't remember the finer details, but you sort of get the gist.
You're getting old, Hamish.
Yeah.
Also inside FME comes with a whole bunch of stuff for the creation of things. So what I'm thinking of here is the ability to read schemas, to understand how those schemas are developed, and also dynamically write schemas. If you're talking Excel, you can write hyperlinks, you can write formulas, and be able to actually put those into cells, not just the data value. So
even like cell ranges, you can define cell ranges within a template, and then instead of just having a tabular setup of data, you can have one cell out on one side that actually has a cell range, a defined area, and FME can write directly into that.
Yes, and by having all those things, you kind of use data to drive it and what your outcome is, but the processes, you might not be dealing with the data, you might not be calculating the data. I mean, the Esri side is a really good example where we've got processes internally, which basically you can set your schema up in an external table and say, it is the name field and it's got an alias of, I don't know, name, and a whole bunch of other bits and pieces, and then run an FME process that converts that into a table that is, an Esri World file geodatabase, or you flick of the switch, change it over, and it writes out to an SDE table.
I just want to follow up something you mentioned there before, Todd, was around that concept of data. So I've been working with a client recently, and part of the process is to migrate data. This is dozens of different file formats. Basically, they dump information into a Azure blob, and it needs to be moved to another Azure blob. And I was talking about, so from the FME process, the FME's point of view, the data is these individual file paths, not the content of the files. So I was talking about, I'll be validating the data, thinking of, making sure that those files are, exist, not caring about the content. And then the client was like, oh, but how can you read those? I thought FME wasn't able to read these proprietary data formats. And I was like, then I suddenly realized that my concept of data was a level below what their concept of data was. They were talking about the contents of the file, but I was actually talking about the file as the data.
Yep.
And that was just suddenly like a light bulb moment. It's like, oh, I've been talking about everything at this level, and the client hasn't actually understood what it meant. So I then had to go back and clarify all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we jump to some of the the Esri side of things, Safe's built on a whole bunch of stuff. So you can create your domains, your Esri domains, or lookup tables is kind of what everyone else calls them, and just a whole bunch of other things, subtypes, and a whole range of things that don't necessarily have anything to do with the data you're processing, because you could actually be creating just the tables and the schemas and the structures. And on the same way, we can be using FME to write bespoke processes for checking that things align. So in that same process, we've got a check that goes through and checks the schemas all align between the 37 different tables. So, if you've got
if you update data domain on this table, that you make sure it's reflected across.
If you say a diameter's in millimeters, metric system, then that is expecting it to be an integer and not a double.
Yeah.
And that across those 37 things, if we've said diameter millimeters, that everyone has put in a integer field, so we don't have variance across those different tables. And that kind of QA process is really easy within FME.
Yeah, and that's not querying the data, that's querying the schema itself as if it's data, so that you can just kind of say, well, does this field have this expected data type?
Yes, yeah. And just making sure everything fits. Especially when you come into, many places will put rules around what their schemas should look like. It's lowercase, it's uppercase, it's
camel case or this,
uppercase or whatever. And, being able to test that before it gets created into a table that's gets filled in, and then they go, oh, we mucked that up.
And then you have to truncate it and update the schema, or
and sometimes you
create
can't, and because it's all filled with data, and that's now linked in with these other things that are looking at that field. So, FME can drive a lot of those processes just with a bit of forethought into actually building those processes in FME to start off with. And
so we touched on the generation of configurations, but what about, if you've got a massive amount of SQL data that you need to process and you want to build some SQL scripts? And I'm no SQL expert. My knowledge of that extends to about a select all from table where 1 equals 1. But Chris, I know you've got some really good thoughts on that.
Yeah, so this came up in the context of writing data quality scripts to run over kind of a whole lot of SQL tables across maybe a couple of different databases. We found that FME is just easier to write SQL scripts than it is in SQL. Because if you need to query 60 different tables for certain values or certain parameters, you're saying where these fields are not null, or where making sure they have dates in the right range, etc. In SQL, that's a different statement per table, and you can definitely write it in dynamic and cursor through if you want to and do all that. But it's a whole lot cleaner to have an FME workspace that builds that SQL script and then executes each of those statements, because a SQL executor will run the statement for each thing that passes into it. And so it's quite easy to build a workspace that builds a statement for every table and then just executes all of them in a line, and the results that you get out of it are your errors or are your changes or whatever you're wanting to do.
So yes, Chris, I believe you've created a wee demo here, or an example.
Yeah, so this is just a simple example that I put together of what a statement would look like. Very simple. But if you were to do this in SQL, it's still easy enough, but you have to worry about what are the data types of each of the parameters each of the variables that you're building. And whereas in FME, you just substitute the values in, and it just works like a whole lot more simpler or closer to when you're writing a script directly. Because if you're working in dynamic SQL, then you have to worry about triple quotes around variables and things like that, and it's just messy.
Yeah. Was this set up to run on something, or just an example?
That previous one we had, it was like a weekly run of data quality scripts, and so we had a table that would say for each of the feature types and the attributes and the rules that were to be run over them, and then it would just collect all that together and then run it in a way where it was just like select the count of errors that match this criteria, and then write it out to say, well, these are for this table, this error type had this number of errors, and then we could then track that over time and see, were there any errors that were actually, a whole lot of them could be zero, a lot of them were zero, but some of them weren't. And you just have that running, and it's just much easier than having to have some complicated dynamic SQL that's harder to understand.
Yes. Yeah, that's another thing that I really like about FME. And sometimes you can build really complex stuff, but sometimes you go, well, someone else could pick this up, and I might be able to create something that looks super cool that gets done in a few bits, same as the SQL thing. But when you leave, the organisation, or you're away on holiday and then something happens,
which is always the case.
But having something that is like repeatable, like that SQL that you just talked about, it's understandable. You don't need to know that much.
And debugging it is really easy, because you can see exactly what the statement is before it passes into the SQL executor, and so you can just kind of copy that into SQL and see, well, does that make sense? Yeah. Whereas in dynamic SQL, you're having to print out to the log what the statement is before it runs, as kind of a way of validating it, which again is messy, especially if it's inside a loop and printing out hundreds of different statements.
Yeah, and it actually reminds me of another example where we run an analyze of an SDE table for a client. So the database is huge, got lots and lots of tables in it, and they basically want us to analyse it often because of the amount of changes and stuff that are going into it. But I was like, oh, I don't want to analyse the whole database because it's going to take ages. So, we built an add-on after it writes to write out a script based on what feature classes get updated each time it runs. So it's only going to, if only 3 of the 50 tables was actually updated with features, only analyse those tables. And again, FME makes it nice and easily, writes out the script. In this case, it's running on a different piece of Python, so it doesn't run internally inside the FME, but we use a call to create a sub-process. I shouldn't get into that. But
in other words, it works.
It works really, and FME is writing the script, and that script dynamically changes based on what happens in FME.
So thank you all for joining us again for another Abley FME Fireside. That's with myself, Hamish, Todd and Chris, and we'll catch you next time. See you later.